Hello everyone. Welcome back to Revival Acres.
So, like you said, my name is Amanda Faus, and I recently released a beta version of the Children's Tradition, and that is a 1st through 5th grade, what will eventually be 1st through 6th grade curriculum for students who we are classically educating them, but we're doing so largely influenced by the work of a man named John Senior. John Senior had written a couple of books called Restoration of Christian Culture, Death of Christian Culture, and in it he talked about the 1,000 good books as preparation for the great books. I was completely compelled by his vision of education, of his wisdom and insight that the great books are something that need to be prepared for, not just in the books we read, though that is central, but even in the culture that we are building in our home. He had a student who is named James Taylor, who had written a book called Poetic Knowledge. And basically those two things together, what James Taylor articulated in his book, Poetic Knowledge, and then what Senior had articulated about building family cultures that embodied the Western experience for our children, and then good books that would prepare our students for the great books of the Western canon. I was just completely compelled by that vision. And so when I first encountered Senior's work, I just assumed that this curriculum already existed, to be honest. Like, his program was in the 1980s. He's gone to be with the Lord many years ago. And so I just assumed that this was out there. And so the first step was that I just went on Google and was trying to find it, and then was quite shocked to find that it did not exist. And so at that point, I set about writing it, only though the whole time thinking somebody is going to email me and tell me that this curriculum already exists and that I've actually put all this work in and that it's out there. But that is not what happened. In fact, I've gotten emails from many wonderful people since then who have affirmed, no, I had been looking too, and it was never out there. And so I just feel tremendously blessed to have had the honor to get to be the bearer of good news for all of those of us who already love John Senior, or for those who maybe were not familiar with his work but love classical education and are wanting to think more deeply about what this should look like for elementary education, and how to faithfully embody a historic classical paideia, a discipleship for our children, and raising them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So that's really where it came from. And yeah, it's exciting to finally have it out in the world and getting to share with everyone.
Yes, I think that's so funny that you thought you were going to get, someone's going to email you saying that it's already been created. And here, all of us were like, somebody create this curriculum. None of us have time, really, honestly, being a mother of 5 kids. Yeah. And you did it. And so I'm so thankful that you did. And you followed the Lord's leading on that, because clearly it has already blessed many, many people, myself included. And I know a lot of my followers. So thank you again.
It is truly, like I said, it is an honor. I quoted in the curriculum, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart that, Charles Spurgeon used it to describe evangelism, but that we are one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And that is how I feel about these ideas. None of them are my own. It is not there. There was zero self-invention that went into this project. My only goal and desire was to articulate and share these beautiful ideas that I was receiving from the work of much more wise and godlier people than myself. So I'm just grateful.
Praise God. Thank you. So you mentioned briefly the poetic mode or poetic knowledge, and I think that is a bit of, people just don't quite understand what that means. But we also have this neoclassical idea in our mind. So when we hear the word classical education or even classical tradition, we automatically go to like the neoclassical that we know of today, and that's not the same. And I think we have to establish that, but I think talking about the poetic mode will help us see the difference between the two. So maybe you can talk about that.
Sure, yeah. So you're exactly right. That I think probably most commonly today, if you say classical education, people are going to think of something in the stream of lost tools of learning or the well-trained mind, something, or classical conversations. These are all examples of basically different types of programs that were a huge thrust in the beginning of the classical education movement. So honor where honor is due. Wonderful minds like Doug Wilson or Susan Wise Bauer were huge in getting classical education off the ground in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. That said, because it was early on in the recovery, you could say that maybe some mistakes were made or misunderstandings were had because of just it was at the beginning, right? And so, it's easy to come here now 30, 40 years later and be like, well, they got this wrong or they got that wrong. And I never want to have that attitude to be critical spirited towards those who I would, yes, call neoclassical. My desire, though, is to point out that what they had was some really good desires, right? Like, let's go back to the historic way of teaching. But because of the limitations on the resources they pulled from initially, primarily Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools, they then got a few misunderstandings tied up into things. So, primarily the main one being that the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric were stages of learning, as opposed to historically, what they do know this, but then what we all now know is that these were arts of learning, really the arts of language. And so to take something that was an art of language, an art of learning, and then call it a stage really ended up probably communicating some unhelpful things, restrictive mindsets about what you were supposed to be doing with each age group, that really then, in that sense, broke them off from the tradition. Because historically, a elementary education was grammar school, right? This is what people did before they went to university. They went to grammar school. Grammar school is historically not, we think grammar, we think, oh, nouns, verbs, parsing out like what actually is more properly called scientific grammar, right? How to diagram a sentence. But grammar historically was actually like everything you needed to know to understand books and language. So that was geography, that was history, that was just even like hermeneutics, like honestly, like interpretation of symbols. Modern man is very skeptical of symbolic readings or allegory, but historically that was one of the main modes people would write. I think of something like Aesop's fables, right, which have been around for thousands of years. And we all know that these stories about foxes and ravens or whatever animal it might be are not really just about foxes and ravens. It's actually giving you a moral, right, masked under this symbolic meaning. So things like that really were tied up into this holistic idea of a grammar school education. Historically, it really also meant learning Latin, right? Like Latin was the primary language being taught in grammar school. And through learning Latin, they were, again, learning history, geography, just what we would now come to more think of as the humanities. And so with that in mind, when we think of what historically a grammar school was, it's also then important to understand what was called gymnastic and musical education. So gymnastic and musical education, we now have to put in our curriculum. But that's very interesting because historically they weren't so much a part of the curriculum as a part of the culture. Right. So cultures were in the practice of, with Greeks, gymnastic would have been, wrestling, archery, very physical activities. Men were going to war. So it was just normal. If you were a man in those cultures, you were going to learn physical activities that would prepare you to be strong and courageous and be able to fight. That was just a part of the culture. The same with musical education. Musical education really goes back to that root of muse, which is this cultivation of wonder, like the muses, so the sources of inspiration. So this was history, this was literature, poetry. These muses inspired people with their songs and their stories, and that inspired wonder, ultimately. So wonder is at the heart of a musical education. But again, you didn't go to school for that so much. You were hearing these stories around the campfire. You were hearing these songs in the field as people were working. And so what is interesting about modern man today is that we have what John Senior called a depleted cultural soil. And because our cultural soil is so depleted, we then have to essentially put into our curriculum as school all of these things that would have for ancient man or medieval man just been a part of their life. So we do folk songs, we sing psalms, we do all these things that before you just went to church to learn to sing the psalms, right? That was primarily what was sung. Or you just learned folk songs, again, around the campfire, as your mom was in the kitchen, she would be singing different folk songs. And no one ever had to teach her, well, here's the folk song, and now we're going to go over the lyrics. Like, this was just their way of life. And so that brings us now finally to what you were asking about, poetic knowledge. Poetic knowledge is the how we learn musical education. So musical education is the what, this education in wonder. That's why you'll see the tagline of the children's tradition is an embodied education in wonder. That's because the embodiment is the gymnastic side of the education, which ultimately, I didn't mention this, but ultimately in history expanded far beyond just physical education. So this ultimately came to include the training of the senses, your physical sense of smell, your taste, your touch. So that embodiment was the gymnastic piece. And then in wonder was the musical piece. So that's the what. But the poetic mode of learning is how. How do we learn in a way that cultivates wonder? How do we come to a point in our learning, or for our children, how do we bring our children to a place where they can learn and be in awe and cultivate and nurture that wonder? And so that is through the poetic mode of learning, which would be a learning by experience, by participation, by life on life, hands-on experience, getting to, sit with the thing. Yesterday, my daughter, I was reading a book. My children were playing at a creek bed, and my daughter grabbed a big old rock, and she was just sitting there for like probably 5 minutes, just like looking at the rock, and she's kind of like rolling it around and seeing like it wasn't smooth, so it wouldn't roll very well. And then she turns and looks at me, and clearly someone's been listening to Mom talk recently, but she said, Mom, how do you come to know a rock? Do you read a book about a rock, or do you sit with the rock? Do you look at the rock? Do you just spend some time with the rock? And then she looks at me with that knowing look, and she goes, I think you know what the answer is. And I was just cracking up because I'm like, my daughter, who, yes, let's be honest, has been hearing me talk about the poetic mode a lot recently with all of my friends, trying to like get them on board and see what I'm talking about here with the curriculum. But she was completely right. Like, that's what I am trying to explain, right? Is that not that there's never a place to read a book about rocks, right? Books about rocks are great. But ultimately, if a child has never sat with a rock, hasn't thought of, ultimately, then let's say later, think about when God says, I am a rock. Right? Like, what is that? I mean, like, there are layers to rockness that are actually worthy of our contemplation and our experience that will take years. And so basically that poetic mode, again, is that experience of things by which we form a relationship to them. We participate in them in a sense. Now rocks and rockness are now in my daughter's mind and imagination. She then can later relate that idea of rockness to something like God. And it goes and goes from there. And so in these younger years, we want to be cultivating this experiential life of reality, where we are not putting things in between them and reality. We are not studying the world as a distant object, but in fact, we are giving them a hands-on experience of that reality as much as we possibly can. And then with books, the piece of that with stories is that not only do you have outer senses that need to be cultivated, so like I already said, your sight, your hearing, but you have inner senses. Every person possesses inner senses. And that would be your common sense, which would just be you see a rock, I see a rock, and we both know it's a rock. So that's what Senior or Taylor would have called common sense. And then after that, there is the memorative sense, or your memory, right? We all have a memory, and depending on how much you practice recalling things to memory and bringing them back to mind, something you've already learned, the stronger your memory will be, or not. Then thirdly, you have an imaginative faculty. This is just every image that exists in your mind. And what is very fascinating about the human imagination is that we can not only take the things we've actually seen, but we could put two things that we've seen together to make something that we have not seen, right? And hence then we see a world, we can imagine a world where there are dragons or where people fly. It's not because we've seen people fly, it's because we've seen birds fly and we've seen people. And so we can combine those two ideas and imagine a world in which people could fly. And so that lastly leaves us then with the perceptive faculty, which would be more commonly is called like your moral imagination today. I think, the work of like Vegan Gurian with Tending the Heart of Virtue has talked about that. But just this idea that your gut level, like your conscience, right? Like your conscience, your inner sense of this is good and this is bad. And while we're all born with a natural perception of something's goodness or badness, our life experiences and our education and our knowledge ultimately will shape that faculty to be truer and more correct, or to be weaker and less correct. This is where the role of discernment, right? Just depending on how much your perceptive faculty has been strengthened through good stories, then your discernment will be better. And so with all of these inner senses, we are wanting to teach to a child's memory, to a child's imagination. And again, we do that through an immersive participational experience of books that, and some books do that better than others. So we're going to orient the curriculum for history, for example, around biographies and historical fiction, or, literature is just, generally good at this, right? It immerses us in someone else's life for, 200 pages or 300 pages. And so this immersive participational aspect is what we're really trying to get at with the children's tradition, because this is the best way for children to learn. It's suited to knowledge. And really, if you have not learned in the poetic mode for arguably many years, your ability to have scientific knowledge, analytical knowledge, rhetorical or dialectical knowledge is going to be hindered. And so we have to lay this foundation of poetic knowledge so that later it's almost as if poetic knowledge is like the trunk. And then you're going to have these branches of other types of knowledge that will come out of it, right? So dialectical knowledge, the ability to have conversations and discuss things, or scientific knowledge, the ability to know facts and to be able to analyze those facts and see, make experiments or, things of that nature. You need to have experienced the world to be able to effectively do even scientific analysis. And so it's not that we're saying that those other types of knowledge are bad. We're just saying that you need a strong trunk to hold all those branches. And the more you intend for those other branches to grow, the stronger you want the trunk to be.
Right. Exactly. Oh, thank you so much. I think that will be really helpful for people as they're trying to understand where, this curriculum that you've created is coming from. It's deeply rooted, pun intended, in this great classical tradition. And I think Andrew Kern, I was listening to something from Circe Institute, and he was saying how Lewis is the master of not arguing, but just having you experience something. And that's how I visualize the poetic mode. We just want our children to experience real life. And through that, their imagination then is blossoming, and they can make these like odd connections, like a unicorn doesn't exist, or did it? I don't know, but but they can make these connections and it becomes real to them. And that's how I think about it, is like, we don't need to argue them or analyze them into knowing. First, they need to just experience, just like a conversion experience, to know who Christ is. You have an experience of love first, and that's what brings you into this relationship of knowledge. And then you can go from there and analyze. And we talked a little bit about email about just how it all rests in the love of God for us and our love for Him. And I don't know if you can expand on that just a little bit, because it's such a beautiful way to look at that. As Christians, education is separated. Like, there's not curriculum in church or my spiritual life and my education. It's all one.
Well, I have a deep love of Aristotle, and Aristotle had what we would call the four causes. And the four causes were these modes of being, right? Like, how does something come to be, for example? And so, or how is something, like, how is it, which is how does it have being, right? So you would have like formal cause, which is its definition. But one of the things he talks about is efficient cause, right? So what is it that moves something, right? To go from one type of thing to another type of thing. And so we can ask the question, what is it that takes someone from uneducated to educated, to lacking knowledge to knowing something? And it was really St. Augustine who answered that question so well for us in the historic Christian tradition, when he taught that knowledge of something and knowledge of something and love are synthetic, integrated. They go together, right? So you cannot know something properly if you do not love it. And you cannot love something if you do not know it. And so, right, if you've never encountered something, then you can't love it. So basically, this integrated relationship of love and knowledge, like you said, is essential to the curriculum, because we recognize that love is embedded throughout. And speaking to that efficient cause, love is the energy of this type of education. It is what moves us. It is what moves us to go from not knowing to knowing. It is what we hope will move our child from uneducated to educated, which is a completely different definition of knowledge than the world, right? Like, we are talking about a very lofty standard here that says that and really Charlotte Mason articulated this so well, right? When she said that it is not how much a child knows, but how much they care, right? She's saying the same idea, right? The idea is whatever facts have filled their mind when they graduate, becomes completely irrelevant if they do not love the knowledge they have, the knowledge they possess. And so, like you said, this is on every layer. This is the love of the relationships of parents and children, as we're teaching them, of the child for their parent, as they want to be in sympathetic relationship with their parent and experience their parents' love and learn together and grow together. And also for all of us as a collectively as a family, receiving the love of God.
Right. Thank you so much. I wanted to mention that you have a Substack. We have a podcast and a website and a Substack. And I really appreciated the last couple episodes, or you're kind of in the middle of the musical episodes, right? You're doing a part 2. And then you had one on gymnastics. And I think that's going to be really helpful for people, because those are, when you think of, I mean, the Olympics are about to happen. So when you think of gymnastics, you're thinking like tumbling and all this, which it could mean that, but there's more to it. It's more about character. I feel like the building of character within the gymnastics physical realm. And then, of course, music as well as the basis of that. And you shared a quote from, let me see, John Ruskin, The Crown of Wild Olive. And I think this epitomizes the children's tradition and everything we're going for. So I just wanted to read that. The entire object of true education is to make people not merely do the right things, but enjoy the right things. Not merely industrious, but to love industry. Not merely learned, but to love knowledge. Not merely pure, but to love purity. Not merely just, but to hunger and thirst after justice. And I believe this is what the poetic mode, this is what we want for our children. I know that's what I want for my children. And this is what we're hoping through this curriculum is going to help us achieve within our children's hearts and souls.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's really common for well-meaning Christians to say something to the effect of, well, love is an action. They'll say love is an action. So, it's not really about how you feel, it's about what you do. And of course, they're responding to a completely emotional, subjective culture that makes everything about how you feel. So then if you don't feel like it, you're not going to do it. So obviously we would also reject that. I think what has been lost, though, oftentimes in that conversation is the recognition that, well, of course, we all have times where we are doing the right thing when we do not feel like doing it. Of course, that's doing our duty to God and man because we're fallen. We're going to feel that a lot of the time. At the same time, though, we do not want to stop there. Like our goal in even doing the right things when we don't feel like it is to get our feelings on board. Our feelings are not irrelevant. They're a symptom of a deeper issue or a deeper flourishing. So we want our emotions and specifically our children's emotions when we're talking about homeschooling to slowly but surely come more and more in line with the life of God, right? We're talking about being in the life of God, of having communion with him and experiencing that communion through family relationships, through the created order, nature, all of those things. But yeah, that Ruskin quote really gets to the heart of why we are really aiming for a very high goal. But I think it's also a wonderful thing for our children to sense that, and even just the atmosphere of our life, that we will not settle for a mere facts-based education.
Right.
We will not claim that you know anything just because you got through and checked a box off that day. Did you love today? Did you delight today? Did you enjoy? Did you praise God today? Were you grateful today? That is for our family. And I say that is the standard for our family, even as I want to also reiterate that we fall short of that standard often, all the time. And that is why we have to repent a lot. I think it was George Grant who said that education is repentance. And let me tell you, that is very much tied up in all of this, because we are all constantly having to repent of our own lack of loves when we should be loving things. And just the sin that, quite frankly, comes out when you're homeschooling, because it does when you're right.
Yes.
All these humans being together, being human. So
yes, exactly. Definitely have that here too. So you're not alone. So let's move into going from there in this idea of we're beginning in the poetic mode, and that's where we want our children to be. I have a lot of people asking then, well, okay, but then you have this curriculum for years 1 through 6, although there is some year 7 books in there, I noticed. When do they get out of this mode, or what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, Senior definitely was advocating that we stay in the poetic mode through elementary, middle school, and high school education. So he really saw it as all of those years were preparation for the liberal arts, but the liberal arts were something that people do at the college level. That's probably not super popular today in the classical education movement, because we're constantly talking about, oh, we're doing the liberal arts, and we're talking about that in the of younger children or
Right.
maybe middle school or high schoolers. But senior really wanted us to maintain the historic understanding of what the liberal arts were, which again was a university level education. So for that reason, what does it look like next? Well, the philosophy stays the same, right? Like you could read the philosophy of the children's tradition and take that philosophy with you into middle school or high school. What would look different is that you have to then go further into like further down the book list, right? So it's 1,000 good books. He has, nursery, school years, adolescence is what comes next. So that's 12 to 16. And then after that is youth, which would be 16 to 20. So you wouldn't even get through all of the youth books before they graduate high school, obviously. But that's kind of the trajectory. Personally, a lot of people are asking about having follow-up years for the curriculum. So that's something I'm praying about and thinking about. I feel such a love and a duty now towards all the families who have invested their families into this curriculum that I'm like, okay, like I guess I might need to write the next piece of this curriculum. But what I will do with that is I will do exactly what I've done with the younger years, which is take the next sections of the book list. I will separate them out to how many we would need to cover each term to get through them in the matter of years that he had assigned them to. And then I will say, what I loved when I looked at I've started to look at those upper years. He has wonderful things like autobiographies and biographies. He has travel diaries. He loved travel diary type things. He includes a lot of those for the middle schoolers, and he includes them for the older ones as well. So what I think we can take from his philosophy and from the books he assigned, and then also, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I know on page 151 of Poetic Knowledge, James Taylor described the history of the history piece of the IHP and how they were doing Plato's Republic and the Persian Wars. And so both of those, I think we can deduce some principles for even the younger years, right? Again, that was the college level. So we're not necessarily going to be jumping into the Republic or the Persian Wars, but we can deduce that, well, we're going ad fontes, we're going back to the sources, right? So again, that's why autobiographies become really important. I know he has on there, for example, that students in the upper years are reading like Christopher Columbus. Like personally, I didn't even know Christopher Columbus had written anything until this year when I was looking at seniors list, and I'm like, does he have Christopher Columbus on there? I'm like, okay, well, apparently we need to read, I think it's like, the journeys to the America, I don't even know what it's called, but the point is that he has those types of things, right? James Cook, right? Like the Adventures of Cook, things like that, where, so he's going back to the sources on the list. I would say this is where I've mentioned a few other places, and I will say for myself, where I might perceive or feel that there's maybe a little bit of a gap in his list would be some of those more, like things that I would think are essential to read in high school, like reading the Declaration of Independence, for example, right? Like you're not going to find that on his book list because it's not a book, right? So I think this is where the Norms and Nobility by David Hicks is really helpful because it outlines a 7th through 12th grade curriculum. And there are things about David Hicks's curriculum that I wouldn't follow exactly. So for me, what I would do is I would start with seniors list and I would fill in the history, especially with David Hicks. So he has some great stuff, great recommendations, using the example of American history where he points to some speeches that you should look up. And so I think if we can think of the trajectory, I'm just going to stick with the example of American history, like of let's say the Revolutionary War, for example. Hopefully you will have read like G.A. Henty has a book that's written in that time period. So that would have been assigned in maybe say 6th grade or 7th grade. And so we would have had a child who would have read some historical fiction from that era. I'll just mention something like Johnny Tremain. That was one of my childhood favorites. It's a historical fiction book from that time period. And then they could have begun to read something like maybe the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, right? And then, it's 4th of July, so we read the Declaration of Independence, right? Like there's just little family patterns even that you can be learning these things, right? Like try to take a trip out to Colonial Williamsburg, or even I'm in California and there's colonial reenactments, that are about an hour away. So maybe find a colonial reenactment nearby. Like try to get that experience of where you can form out the imagination in your child of what it was like to live in the colonial period. But then again, going back to those more original sources, I think becomes more and more important as they are getting into those older years. Most history books, if I dare say, all history textbooks, they're written through a lens. They're written through the lens of that author. And so there just is a danger to bias. One of my, dare I call it, a badge of honor for this program is that I've had people across Christian traditions reach out to me on whether it's a Protestant concerned that, oh, like, is this going to be biased against Protestants because, John Senior was Catholic, or Catholics reaching out because they know I'm a Protestant and say, oh, like, is this going to be biased towards Catholics? And I can just say on all fronts, it's not biased to anyone because it is going back to the sources of the Western canon. And so because of that, I'm sure there are books that will, take a shot at a Protestant, and there are books that will take a shot at a Catholic, but that's because that is a battle that has been happening in the West for 500 years. And so it's history is the great equalizer in that sense. And so because we are focused on, I think about the American Revolution, something I've never done in my life that I intend to do with my children is I want to read what the British were saying at that time. Like, I've only ever heard the American side of that argument. And especially as I grow older and I think about, well, what is the relationship of people to a king, for example? Like, I have questions now, like, was it right for us to secede from a king? Are you allowed to do that biblically? But I don't have time to think about that right now. So in like 5 years, when my daughter is at that point, I'm going to cover things like that with her. So I hope we can have fun with it, but just realizing that the participation, the experiential appeal to the imagination, none of that goes away. And so it doesn't mean you might not have a book on your shelf that has like an overview of American history. But the thing about the children's tradition is that we always have to make choices with our curriculum. And so I think what John Senior gives us with his book list, but then also what was my heart and how I tried to set everything up, was that we're going to make the curriculum the best of the best. That doesn't mean you're not going to read other books. That doesn't mean you're not going to maybe include other things that you personally as a mom are like, but I really loved doing this thing over here. There are things that I really love doing in my family that I did not put in the curriculum, only because I did not think it was worth defending as, no, this is the best of the best. You should do this. Everybody should do this. And so one thing that's been encouraging to hear is many people have told me, oh, like, you've made it simple. And that's very refreshing to me because that was my goal. I intentionally left plenty of good things out because I was like, but it's not the best thing. And so if we're going to direct our attention, let's direct it to the best thing. Let's direct it to the best things in the Western canon, the best books, the best experiences. And then each family can include, for the good things, all those other things that they're going to do. But I want to direct people's attention to the best.
Right. Okay. That definitely answered my question, because remember, I have a H.E. Marshall. Yes. I was thinking about it. I'm like trying to analyze in my own mind and like think about the beginning chapters of this, definitely because it's myth, legend. And then as it goes on, I was thinking, okay, I see it now. You're right. It definitely gets into more of like an analytical view of history because she's walking through, England's history. But again, like you said, I think there's a lot of freedom in your curriculum and there's a lot of space. Like you give us the best of the best, but there's space to do more if you want, or to take something out if you've already done it. So that might mean I can fit in maybe a spine that I really think has value for our family, whatever it is. And that's okay because it's my family and it's unique. But I do appreciate, you're right. You give us the best. And then from there, we can do what we want with it. But it's nice to have a framework just to be like, okay, this is what we're trying to aim for. And then the whole beginning of your curriculum is just, it's amazing. It's a philosophy. Like, that's an education of itself for the parents, for the mother. Take that and do what you want with it. So you can do both together, or you can just learn and glean and then build your own too. And I think that's a value for parents to know as well.
I definitely had curriculum DIYers in mind when I made it. I did not make it thinking that most people were just going to follow it cookie cutter, because I think especially even once you have more like 2 students and once you've gone over 1 student,
right?
You generally as families want to kind of keep everyone on the same page as much as possible within reason. Of course, like as older kids get older, like you shouldn't be combining necessarily like a 1st grader and a 6th grader. I think that there's certain books you could combine, but generally it's like, no, those are very different levels. So like out of respect for the dignity of each of them, let's let them do what they need to do for their respective education. But if you have a 1st grader and a 3rd grader, or a 2nd grader and a 4th grader, like these are things where you can easily loop a lot of the books. And I just assume people would, right? And, you know, like you're saying, if you as a parent have a book that you love, that's my primary concern, right? I think many people's response to a spine is not love. It's just, it becomes a box to check. But if you had an experience where you were reading that spine and you're like, no, I love this book, it's so inspiring, and you can share that love with your children, well, great. Like, that's wonderful. Like, it's not like that is some strict law. I just would say, make sure you're doing those deeper experiences of the biographies and autobiographies where they're spending time with one person for longer so that they really know that one person. But yeah, what you do the rest of the time, you know, it's still good stuff.
Yes. And I think that was another question that people asked me is, how do I combine? And I did mention, because we had talked a little bit, you combine by forms. That's probably the best way. You know, form 1, grades 1 through 3, form 2, 4 through 6. You can combine a lot of things together as a family, singing time, you know, musical, gymnastic education, those things. That was a major question. And then another question I received is, what history cycle are you doing? And so you might want to expound on like the way you do history, because I think people are confused about the tradition of that.
Yeah, so we do not follow a history cycle. So kind of like I was already saying, we are trying to give our children an experience of history. I really relied on Charlotte Mason to articulate some of these ideas in synthesis with John Sr. in the curriculum, because I think, especially in home education, she talks about, you know, whether or not you do a spine is not very important, but if you can spend time, is the language, you know, spend time with one person and know him really well. Through that one person, you know, that period of history. You know, by reading about Ben Franklin, you now know something about what it was to be a colonial American. So through that individual, your vision is expanded beyond that. And so the other part of this is that just on a practical level, children do not think linearly. And so this idea of a history timeline or history cycles, especially, it's not that it's a bad thing. Like, I don't want to say, I'm not trying to throw stones at it in any way. It's just more that for the purposes of this curriculum, and because we are focused on cultivating the poetic mode of learning, it's just not necessary. Like, we're going to be focused on books that are giving that cultivation of their imaginative sense, that deep love for history. That's something I've talked to friends who love history. I'm someone who deeply loves history. I think you might have even mentioned this. But when we think back, well, why? Like, why do we love history? And what we all would say is like, oh, well, you know, like, we grew up reading the Dear America books, or, you know, oh, like all of the American Girl books, you know, like, oh, I just love Samantha. And then I was like knowing something about being a Victorian, right? Like, whatever it was, those aren't even like high quality literature. Those are historical fiction that captured our imagination, so that later, when we were old enough and our minds were prepared to understand something like a history cycle, to understand the timeline of history, that we had all this imagination pieces built out, so that when we encountered maybe drier text, whether that is something like an autobiography, biography that's just an older book, so it's maybe harder to read, but even like a spine, right? Something like that later, if you encounter it later, that you will already have all of this like rich soil for that book to grow in. So it's like, it's fine. Like, your love of history can continue to grow, because now you have enough, you know, roots in that soil, so to speak, to hold you and hold up that study of history that goes maybe into a more analytical approach to history. But yeah, so we don't do history cycles. So we just read the next book. Like, it's really very uncomplicated. Like, we just read the next biography. We read 50 Famous Stories by James Baldwin, because that's a family favorite, and it, you know, introduces you to some common ones. But as far as looping, to answer your other question, this is, like you said, I mean, you can group it by forms. It also might look a little different from that. So my kids are going into 2nd and 4th grade this year. And I think for many people coming in, you know, especially if you're coming in as a 4th grader, especially for something like history, unless you've been doing a very robust literary approach to education previously, you might be better served starting that 4th grader in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, which are year 3. Now, in my kid's case, it wasn't that my daughter was not prepared on a literary level, but she had not read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. We haven't done them. So I was like, well, we need to do them. And my son, conversely, had already we had read all the Delaires. We had read 50 Famous Stories. Like, he has done what is, yes, on paper, the year 1 and 2 books, even though he's only going into year 2 right now. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to combine them into year 3 for history. And we're just going to read the Ingalls books together. So, you know, as much as the forms are very good, general guidelines, don't feel bad if you think, you know what, I'm just going to use my discernment here and decide that this would actually work better. I think there's certain things you have to preserve across forms. Like in year 4, they begin things like Plutarch.
Right.
They begin written narrations. Just because you're doing, let's say, your 2nd and 4th grader together does not mean that the 2nd grader should now do Plutarch, or that the 2nd grader should have to do written narrations, right? Like those things have to remain divided just because it's about a level and ability. We do only oral narrations for the first 3 years. So those are little things that just obviously are not too difficult to parse out of what things you can combine. Literature is generally easy to combine. History, depending on the book, may or may not be good to combine. So you just have to think through it and what's best for your family and what's best for your respective students and where they're at in their education.
Right. Yeah. So I have year 6, 4, and 2, and we're combining a lot because we've done a lot of the books that you recommended for history already as family. So we're able to do a lot of the history together because we're kind of just like moving up the list, so to speak, and we're just doing it together because it works out for us, even though I do have a span. And then of course my 2nd year will not do Plutarch when I'm doing Plutarch with my 4th through 6th. That'll be something we'll do separate. But it's so easy to combine, especially if you've already done a literature-based approach to your curriculum choice. You can find where you can combine, where you can't. I feel pretty easily and make it work for your family. And then you mentioned narration because that was something that you took from Charlotte Mason. You continued over, and because Charlotte Mason is coming from a classical, we don't need to separate them. We can do them together. And my question is, so we do narration. What about maps and Book of Centuries? I feel like those can easily come into play, and I'm assuming you recommend, but maybe expand on that.
Yeah, so I would say for maps, we just, as like a natural family habit, if we're reading about someone who lives somewhere other than here, which is, pretty much all the time, then we'll just grab our globe and we'll look it up. I will say senior definitely cautioned us against introducing things like maps and atlases and all this stuff too early. I think he was concerned that it might just be an over analytical approach to something too early. That said, I really think that depends on your atmosphere. Personally, like I'm like, no, like my kids love looking at the maps, and I don't think it's, I think it's helpful because it's building out their imagination. He still believed we needed to teach geography, so he certainly wasn't saying like throw it all out. He was, I think it was just being conscious of the mode in which we share it, right? I think like I would not have a child in Form 1 be like diagramming a map yet. I think that is something we intend to do in our tutorial program for the upper years as they learn things like the 50 states. And, it becomes helpful for them to be able to know, practice their writing and filling in, each of the states, for example. So there's a place for it, but I would say definitely I would defer those things for the 2nd form, just so that we really, those first 3 years are just experiencing, enjoying, and not calling upon a child to perform so much. I think that's one of the more destructive tendencies of modern education is from, not just kindergarten, from pre-K, TK, like they are immediately wanting results, test results, prove that you've learned something, do this test, check this box, let us be able to prove that we have taught you something. And that's just really unhelpful and unsuited to a child. Really, it's unsuited to a human being, but I think it's particularly destructive to a small child who just wants to be. Like, they just want to be in the world. They just want to listen to mom read some books. They just want to go play outside. Like, so much of the poetic mode is letting children be. And that's enough, that we're not calling upon them to. Yes, we do narrations, like you said. I call it in my curriculum that it was the missing piece of the IHP. That was John Senior's college program that he did with a couple other professors. But because narration is this incredible skill that gives you the capacity to participate in a story with your own language, right? So a child, they imitate the words of the author. They are getting to basically participate on a whole nother level. And this will then additionally cultivate their memory so much more deeply because they've narrated. So the idea of narration coming from Mason really just fits so perfectly and cohesively with Charlotte Mason. said, Charlotte Mason and classical education are not two different things. I think Charlotte Mason is best known and understood within the tradition. The only danger comes with it, if we did this to any single person, if we took one person and put all of our stock in them, then what can happen is we might project our own modern ideas onto them. So much of it's Charlotte Mason. I don't think Charlotte Mason got things wrong. I think what we do to Charlotte Mason can sometimes go wrong. But when you situate Charlotte Mason within the classical tradition, I think there's a clarifying that happens. When I think of some of, all my favorite like Charlotte Mason teachers, like Brandy Wenzel, Cindy Rollins, like, Karen Glass, these are women who are well studied and well versed in the classical tradition, which is what makes their wisdom and insight about Charlotte Mason so amazing and so good.
Right. Yes. And you do have a Substack article that I've been pointing people to, because the question is, how is this different from Ambleside Online? And I think that was very wise of you to post that in your Substack, because I think we don't really touch on it, because I think your Substack explains it very well and kind of compares them bullet points, like how they're different and similar. So I'm just going to recommend that people go and read that, unless you have something more to add.
No, I appreciate you pointing everyone to that. I think I wanted to write it so that everyone had like a go-to example, and I can't emphasize enough that something like Ambleside Online can be done in the poetic mode.
Right.
Again, it just comes to having the philosophy to understand what that means, right? And I think that's the missing piece for many of us, is we just don't have our philosophy strongly in place when we start home educating, and then we're playing catch up. And so what I really wanted to do in writing the children's tradition was give people like, okay, here's like in 35, 40 pages, this is the most important stuff you need to know, that now you can take however many years to build out your philosophy from there. Keep reading Mason, keep reading, the Great Tradition by Richard Gamble, whatever it might be. But here now we're situated. So now we can move on from, like grow from here with this foundation laid, so that we're not missing like the most important pieces for a few years.
Right. Yes. And I would encourage parents, as they're reading through the first half of the children's tradition, where you really lay down the philosophy, narrate it yourself. And you were the recipient of my narrations, thankfully. But it was so important for me to process, coming from not from at all a classical tradition other than Charlotte Mason. But like I said, I became somewhat of a purist in the Charlotte Mason modern take on it. And it really messed with me. And I needed to narrate what I was learning and reading. And we probably should discuss just a little bit about why you don't do subjects, because that's what I started to feel in the pure Charlotte Mason world. So many subjects and like so many things to do. And I was getting a little overwhelmed by it. And I don't know if that's at all what she would have wanted of me. And, but I was. And I think we need to touch on why. And that was a question from a couple people. Why aren't there subjects, or why do you say there aren't subjects?
Yeah, no, I think your experience is a common one. I do. Again, I think you're right that it is our the modern take on Charlotte Mason, what we project onto her. And not that she was perfect. I'm not trying to suggest she was perfect, but I think she was working within the classical tradition. Her ideas were very Platonic, right? She was very much hearkening back to Socrates and a lot of the great books. So she has so much wisdom and insight. But I think because she spoke in a Victorian way and her language, sometimes things just get lost in translation, right? And this is something I'm learning about all of life. It's not just Charlotte Mason, that, we just always read through a lens, everything, right? We have our own understanding of what words mean. We have our past knowledge and past reading, and that's not a bad thing. It's just something we need to be aware of. And so, yes, with Mason, you'll notice in my curriculum that I break it up: knowledge of God, knowledge of man, knowledge of the universe. That's from Charlotte Mason. And so I think some people have not realized that. They think like, oh, that's such a brilliant breakdown you have of knowledge of God, knowledge of man. And I'm like, well, that was Charlotte Mason. I didn't invent that. But the thing about that is that, yes, to your point, it is easy to get bogged down, and people think like what laying the great feast, as she would have called it, means doing 25 things.
Right.
And this is where I think it becomes very important to realize that, yes, like you said, one of the bold claims I say, and then there's an article on Substack, is that we don't teach subjects. Now, what do I mean by that? Because, of course, everybody immediately comes back and are like, we saw your table of contents. I saw history. I saw literature. You did see those things. And it's not the concept of a group of knowledge or a category of knowledge that is the problem. It's what we think of when we say that. Because what we think of when we say we're teaching subjects is that we think as moderns that, oh, there is a group of content that is required for this grade, right? Oh, these are the history bullet points you need to learn in first grade, right? And fourth grade is, this is your state history. So fourth grade state history, here's your bullet points. This is what you need to learn for state history. This idea that the goal is to master content is just A, not in harmony with the tradition, and B, is not the point of what we're trying to accomplish with the children's tradition. We will learn lots of content. Obviously, we're reading all these amazing books. They're like the content is not lacking. But what I want us to realize is that there's going to be families who can cover every book I assigned. In fact, they probably can cover more. They're going to go beyond me. They're going to add books in. They're going to do all the things. And there's going to be other people who can only get through maybe half of the books I assigned. But if both of those families are, to the best of their ability, building out their imagination, cultivating their memory, and doing so in a culture that embodies a love of God and fellow man and a love for their country and a love for one another, like, they're both meeting the goal, because that's the goal. It's those cultivation of those inner senses. That is where narration, you can narrate one book a day, or you can narrate 10 books in a day. Nobody's doing 10 books a day, but let's just say in theory, let's say you had a brilliant child who just wanted to do 1,000,000 hours of school a day and they could narrate 10 books in a day. The point is, are they building out that ability to hear something read and to, not regurgitate, I don't like that word, but to recreate it with their language. If a child is learning that skill, if you're the mom who just had a nursing baby and your oldest only got to do one book and narrate one book that day, you are still making progress in the right direction, and you can receive where you're at in your life season, but keep working on that cultivation of the senses and not stress that, oh, but we didn't cover all the content. Covering content is not the goal. Love is the goal. Cultivation of the inner senses and outer senses is the goal. And so that's why I'm going to just keep saying, well, we're not teaching subjects, because it's not about mastery of content. It is about that cultivation of senses. And so that really, by saying that, I'm hoping that people will just take it as a mind shift. Like, it shakes you up, right? To be like, well, okay, clearly what you're saying is difficult to understand. So now I need to try to understand it. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be difficult so that people might think about what I'm saying. And hopefully then have deeper wisdom, though. Receive the wisdom.
You're trying to make people think. Yeah. Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, I think that will be really helpful for people to understand, because you're right. When you look at the table of contents, you're like, these are, the subjects laid out, but it's not that. It's a principle. We're looking at principles and philosophy as the foundation. And that's really important in understanding the great tradition, and instead of segmenting everything. And I think that might be the difference between the neoclassical realm and then the classic tradition, is the segmenting part of it, where the basis of your curriculum is the knowledge of God and that He exists. Like, that's the foundation. And we're just learning about everything that He created in His mind. And that to me was just so freeing, and also just like, you're right. Like, it was enlightening in a lot of ways too. It's like, I'm just discovering who God is. Like, that's my goal for my children. I want them to know who God is, not like bullet point lists of all these different topics. And no, God reveals knowledge to whomever He wishes, and we just get to be a part of it in awe and wonder. And that is exactly what the children's tradition does.
It is very, very much the goal, right? That what we know about God is the foundation for all other knowledge. And foundation is not even the best word. It's so integrated, because exactly like you're saying, like, our knowledge of God, even like breaking it up, knowledge of God, knowledge of man, it almost seems to imply you know anything about man that is not from God. Right, which is of course silly, right? Like, man is made by God. We're made in His image, and so I hope even that breakdown of categories will not somehow confuse people about what I'm trying to communicate, because you're very right that I want everyone's takeaway to be that whether it's out doing nature study or stargazing or reading these good books, that all of it ultimately is in a culture of worship. That's one of my favorite expressions from Dr. Christopher Perrin. He's summarizing leisure, the basis of culture. But he made his own 4W, summary of leisure, the basis of culture. And it's that wonder leads to worship, wonder leads to worship, leads to wisdom, leads to work. And so just that idea that those are the things we're trying to cultivate.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer the questions of the people, and just giving us a practical look at the curriculum as well. I know a lot of people will really appreciate that. And where can they find you and learn more about if they want the children's tradition?
Yeah, so the curriculum has its own website, so thechildrenstradition.com. And then I am active on Instagram. So that's Mrs. Amanda Foss is my handle. I also, like you mentioned, have a Substack, which is the Wonder Years Substack, which is where you'll also find or get updates when I post to a podcast that I do with my husband. So we're on all podcast platforms as the Wonder Years, and we post as frequently as we can. We're slowly but surely working our way through The Liberal Arts Tradition by Kevin Clark and Robbie Jane. And it's a great book, and I'm hoping that we can be helpful to people as we walk that through. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And again, I'll link everything down below to all your platforms so people can find you. And again, don't forget to use the code Revival Acres for 10% off if you decide to use the Children's Tradition. Thank you so much, Amanda. I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much for having me.